Hey guys, it's Sign here with HobbiesofaMan. Once again, and today we're going to be doing another comic book review. We're going to be looking at the classic Franco-Belgian comic, Valerian, or that's actually how it's known in France, Valerian and Laureline. This is the complete collection, volume 1, available by Cinebook. I think Cinebook, it no longer exists, or it does, but in a weird way, or maybe it's Europe Comics that fucked up and exploded. I can't remember, but Cinebook is a English publisher from England, if I remember correctly. Their books are not that hard to get here in the States, but they're not that easy to get. My recommendation is that you go on Blackwell and just order from there. It's very similar to ordering from Book Depository back when that existed. But this is a complete collection, volume 1 of 7, I think. This is basically the first omnibus of Valerian books, right? And it collects 3 stories across 4 different issues, you can call them, but I think the real name is album, and this would be technically called an integral, right? And it's pretty interesting. If you're a fan of sci-fi and you kind of want to know where sci-fi kind of originates for comic books, you can probably look at this and look at this as the originator, right? And actually, some of the stuff that is included here even talks about that, right? And I'll mention it when I actually review the book. But if you're interested in like old sci-fi because you want to know where modern sci-fi comes from, this is probably a good place to start. However, I can't say that I think it's going to be super interesting for, you know, modern readers, right? Specifically for people my age, right, in their 20s. In the kind of post-Star Wars, post-Terminator, post-iRobot, post-Dune world that we live in, the stuff in Valerian is going to seem pretty simple, right? And so you might not necessarily be super excited about it, but I think that it's worth reading regardless, right? So, yeah, anyway, enough about that introduction kind of spiel. Let's get into the book facts here. So, the title is Valerian. Like I said, it's published by Cinebooks. The authors here are Pierrechristin and Jean-Claude mezieres, or mezieres. I'm not going to try to say it like a French person because I'm going to fail at it. This has an interview with Luc Besson, and there was someone else that was important to this that I wrote down. Their name is Eveline Tranley, and she is the colorist, right? And this is a teen plus book. It's a sci-fi book, kind of straight through. However, because of the nature of the plot, or the kind of basic premise of this set of characters, you can argue that there's elements of fantasy put in as well, depending on the story that they find themselves doing, right? And so it's quite enjoyable in that sense, right? It's a multifaceted sci-fi story, right? It's similar to Star Wars in that sense. And in terms of adaptation, it does have a cartoon. It has that modern movie. I'm pretty sure the modern movie is bad, but that is where I learned about Valerian and Laureline from. However, I've never watched the movie. I saw the trailer. I thought it looked interesting, and then I heard that a lot of people didn't like it, and then I just never watched it in theaters, right? So I don't think I'm interested in watching that movie, and I probably won't anyways, but it does exist if you want to kind of figure out what Valerian and Laureline kind of is. You might want to watch the movie instead of tracking down this book, but probably the cartoon is a better option, right? And in terms of a rating for me, this is a 3.5 out of 5. I think that there's elements here that are important and interesting, and as a collector and someone interested in the history of sci-fi, or interested in sci-fi to a degree that's probably deeper than your average reader, I like this, right? I'm interested in this stuff. But as like a purely like, I bought this to read this and to be entertained, I can't say that I'm super entertained by the stories. There's elements that are kind of weird to me, right? There's a lot of text, which is not necessarily bad, but it's not necessarily what you expect out of comic books, right? There's issues with how old the story is. I mean, this is from the 1970s. This is 55 years old at this point. It's understandable that this would be kind of weird and old and doesn't really flow the way that you expect it to. There's some issues with the paneling because these guys are not necessarily traditional comic book artists that studied comic books in order to become good artists at the medium. They kind of just stumbled across this idea and ended up doing it, right? And so some of the paneling is kind of odd. And sometimes they give you little hints about how to go, and sometimes they don't, and it just doesn't make sense, right? So, and also because this is a European comic, it feels very different from what I'm used to, right? Even old American comics feel different from this, right? So, I wouldn't say that I was super enthused or super entertained by what I read, but I still liked it enough to continue to buy more. And I think that as I read more of them, I get used to the style, I'll appreciate them more, right? So, yeah. And in terms of a premise, I mean, it's kind of hard to nail this down because ultimately every story is different. Though every story has a different premise. However, there is kind of this underlying concept that is two characters, Valerian and Laureline, who are basically time cops, and they go through these different adventures across time and space in order to achieve something, right? Each mission, each time that they go out is a different mission, a different goal that they have to accomplish. And sometimes it succeeds, and sometimes it spirals out into something else. And sometimes they don't succeed, but they manage to finish their mission anyways in some way. And it's interesting. It has a very classic, almost like a procedural vibe to it, right? It kind of reminds me of Stargate, right? Where there's a team, there's a concept that is the Stargate, and every episode more or less is different, right? And then maybe there is an overarching story overall for the season, but it's kind of hard to see it until like the last episode, right? I've not gotten into the last episode of Valerian, as it were, yet, but I can see how there might be this underlying thread that eventually gets pulled, right? I just don't necessarily know what it is yet, right? So it has that kind of idea, right? And so the underlying concept is Valerian and Laureline are time cops, and they go on these different adventures and misadventures and odd situations in order to do something that is necessary, right? So the contents of this book are kind of interesting. So, like I said, there's 3 stories across 4 albums that are mentioned here, but there's also this big interview with Luc Besson, or however you want to say that, at the beginning of this book. And it's kind of odd and interesting because on one hand, it talks about how this guy decided to make this movie and why he decided to make it, and stuff like that. And it's kind of interesting. Like, some elements are cool and why he chose to do these things, right? But at the same time, I'm not interested because I don't care about the movie, right? Then there's this essay here about how it all began, and it tells you the history of Jean-Claude Mezieres and pierrechristin, and how they kind of weren't friends and eventually met, and then they somehow ended up in America. And then from there, they took all of these interesting things that they saw and all of these things that were happening in entertainment at the time. And, out of that sprung Valerian and Laureline, and how Laureline is a really important character because she's the first, right, in quotation marks, because I'm not necessarily sure it's true or not, that she is like the first or one of the first great female characters in sci-fi, one of these important, meaningful female characters for the world. And then they also go after Star Wars, right? They make this claim that, Star Wars completely ripped off of Valerian and Laureline, and then they give you this set of different screen grabs to tell you that this is the case, right? However, without context, this might look true. After you read the story that they're mostly grabbing from here, which one of them is not included here, but the main one that they're talking about is the seminal Valerian story, which is the City of a Thousand Planets, right? Within the context of that story, none of this is relevant to Star Wars. Like, it's not similar at all. Like, there is no... Or there's similarities, but they're very vague. Whereas this is kind of clearly saying, George Lucas directly ripped off of Valerian. And I just don't think that that's true. One, because I don't necessarily think that American creators, specifically George Lucas, were all that interested in European comic books at the time. I'm pretty sure it was very difficult to import them back then. I mean, right now, it's hard to import stuff from Europe, and we're like completely globalized, right, at this point. I'm sure that 55 years ago, it was even harder, right? It was probably very difficult. And I'm not necessarily sure that George Lucas was interested in that stuff, and comic books specifically is what I mean. However, if you want to say that, Ralph McQuarrie and all of the artists that worked with George Lucas to create the universe of Star Wars were inspired by this bande dessinée, that I can believe, but that's not really the assertion that's being made here. So I disagree with that fundamentally. I also care about Star Wars way more than Valerian, so I might be kind of wrong here. But there is something interesting about this, which is that in one of these stories, there's the scenes and the situation that is almost exactly the same as what's happening in One Piece right now. And I thought that was phenomenal. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really great. So I will talk about that in the second segment of this video, or in the third segment, I guess, which is the part that covers the second storyline, right? So if you're interested in how it connects to One Piece, go just check out that section. This moment, the stuff here about Star Wars, I disagree with it. I don't think it's true. And then it tells us what stories are in this book, right? So the first story is Bad Dreams, published in 1967. This is the first time that Valerian is a character in comic books, and he eventually meets Laureline in the story. Then we get the City of Shifting Waters and Earth in Flames, and those are two different stories, as in they're separately published, but they're both published in 1970, and they're actually just part 1 and part 2 of the same story, right? So the City of Shifting Waters is a time travel story back to the pivotal moment in history that ends up creating Galaxity and, where Valerian comes from. And the second part, the Earth and Flames, is the part that really kind of finishes off that story, right? So you can read them as one, and I recommend that that's how you do it, because they are directly, like there's no time that passes between the end of Shifting Waters and the beginning of Earth and Flames, right? Like they're completely together. And then you have the Empire of a Thousand Planets, which is not ever said here to be the seminal story of Valerian, but I really do think it is, because that's what the movie is based on. That's the only story I'd ever heard of before I knew what Valerian was. And I think that it kind of fundamentally does have everything that you need to know about Valerian, and it tells you what Valerian is without actually having to spell out the concepts behind Valerian to you, which is what the other two stories do, right? So the first, the Bad Dreams basically tells you, hey, this is this guy Valerian, and it introduces you to Laureline and kind of the idea of Galaxity and why Valerian is a time cop. And then the Earth, the City of Shifting Waters and Earth in Flames tells you how the world ended and how the utopia that is Galaxity eventually came out of those ashes, right? So this is all still set up of the history of Valerian, is telling you where this character comes from, right? Whereas the City of a Thousand Planets is the first time that you have a story that isn't narrating to you or telling you the history of these characters. It's his own story. It's real set up. It's like watching the second season of Stargate compared to the first one, right? The first one is all about setting up the characters, and you get a backstory about this character and then that character and why this character exists, and all that type of stuff. And then in the second season, you kind of just hit the ground running and you go, and you don't really need to know these backstories because you've already been told them, right? So that's what the difference is between the City of a Thousand Planets, which is, in my opinion, the first proper story, and the other two, or the other three, however you want to look at it, that are just set up for who Valerian and Laureline are, right? So, yeah, but overall, good stuff. I really do like it. So, yeah, I mean, well, I say that after I spent the whole kind of 5 minutes telling you why I didn't like it that much, but I do like it. I think it's cool and interesting, and I really do appreciate this as a fan of science fiction, of someone that's interested in the history of it, and someone that understands that all art and genre of fiction is very much iterative on itself, right? Like it's just a constant kind of like flow and mixing and hodgepodge kind of thing that eventually ends up with an insertion of ideas. And Valerian and Laureline were kind of one of those early elements for what we consider now modern sci-fi, right? But it's good stuff. I really do like it. I think it's interesting, right? So, then that's it for the content of the book. Now I want to talk about each of these stories, right? So let's start reviewing Bad Dreams from 1967, right? So it sets up the status quo of the future. Basically, Earth is now a utopia. There is a single city. It's called Galaxity. And within this city, most people don't actually exist as people anymore. They are in this like kind of matrix setup, right? Where they just hook up to this machine, they dream out their lives, and they have these really great idyllic kind of situations happening with them, right? However, there is still some bureaucracy that this creates, and so there is a group of people that exist to do this, and there's certain people that are nobles that also manage to kind of work through this and actually exist as people outside of these, you know, dream things, right? And one of those people that works, that is a bureaucrat and also kind of an adventurer and a cop of some sorts, is Valerian, and he's mostly a time cop. So his job is to go through time and space and fix things as they're happening, right? And it's kind of interesting because if everyone is constantly dreaming, I don't understand why there would be this need for this time cop position to exist, but apparently it does. And Valerian is someone that really enjoys it. He has this kind of Han Solo swagger to him, and he's fun and interesting, but he kind of isn't like what you would expect like a perfect hero to be, right? He's not evil or anything. He's not an anti-hero, but he's not super heroic or also super like timely or anything like that, right? He's an average guy that just happens to be the main character of the story. So I like that aspect, right? And then we learn that there is this high level like aristocrat guy called Sombul, Xombul, who has escaped into the past. And he's escaped into medieval France. And so Valerian has to go chase him. And when he gets there, he notices that this guy has gotten in contact with this wizard. And he's using this wizard as a tool to basically change time, because Sombul wants to take over the world. He thinks that the way that he would run the world is better than anything that happened originally in time. And so he decides to use this wizard to change everything through making certain people into animals and forcing them to be his beast of burden, essentially, right? It has a very kind of like Cersei and her island kind of thing. It's pretty fun. As Valerian is getting to where Sombul is, he ends up trapped in the forest, in the Arun forest in medieval France, and this is where Laureline comes in. She saves him from this trap, and she has this interaction with him that leads Valerian to bring her with him along on this journey, right? Because she's meaningful, she'll guide him through this place, and it's pretty fun. Then they manage to get to Alberic's castle. Alberic is the wizard, and while they're there, Laureline gets trapped. She gets caught, and Valerian finds Sombul, and then the plot is revealed, which is that he's taking over the world. He's using this wizard's spell to do so, and he's trying to change everything, right? Then some funny stuff happens, but Valerian loses the exchange with Sombul, and Sombul escapes, and then Laureline and Valerian are back to the station, and Laureline goes with Valerian back to the future because basically she figured out that Valerian was from the future in some way. And so this basically leads to her being recruited into the Time Cop Association that Valerian works for. And so she becomes part of this group, and she is Valerian's partner throughout the whole thing. Then they managed to stop Sombul in the nick of time because he managed to go back to Galaxity to take over this Time Cop Association, and they managed to stop him and save the day right in the nick of time, and it's good stuff. And you get introduced to Valerian and Laureline and Sombul and these other characters, which are Gerard, and the superintendent, which is the guy that is in charge of Valerian, right? He's the boss, right? And this story is fun, it's simple, it's enjoyable. My favorite part was the creature design and the kind of like fun, like medieval sword and sorcery aesthetic that most of this had, right? So I really like that. I think it's nice and fun, but the storyline feels a bit ridiculous, and mostly because they spend a lot of time trying to set up Galaxity and the bureaucrats and why they exist and what they do, and ultimately it doesn't really matter because Valerian doesn't really interact with them, right? But you know, stuff like this is great. This classic cartoony old style look that this has, because it is classic and cartoony and old, is great. It really works for me, right? So I like that. This is a good story. It's not necessarily the best story ever, but it's one that I like. So it's fun that it's a fantasy story that has a science fiction kind of start to it, right? It reminds me a lot of Stargate, right? So I like that. Then book 2 or story 2 is The City of Shifting Waters, published in 1970. And this is split into 2 parts. The City of Shifting Waters and then The Earth in Flames. And so the story starts with Laureline and Valerian, and some time has passed. We don't know how much, but we learned that Laureline and Valerian are friends now. They are partners. They work together. They take their leisure time together, and they're playing 3D chess on these weird, clunky computers at Galaxity when they get called in. Apparently, Sambol has escaped from prison somehow, and he's gone back to New York City in the year 1986. Now, this is important and meaningful because 1986 is when the apocalypse began. And this is when the timeline of events that leads to Galaxity's creation started. And so it's very well known that you're not supposed to go here, and no one really knows what happened here because basically there's history up to 1986, and then the apocalypse happens, and then there's no history again until humanity regains its abilities and become like the people that create Galaxity, right? And so there's this giant gap, this void century or two, or maybe millennia, void millennia, across time, right? In this portion of the world. And so it's dangerous to go there, but Valerian has to because Sambol should not be there. And it's important that he doesn't do anything to mess up the timeline because it could destroy everything that Valerian knows, right? And so he goes back there. He ends up in this world that is flooding, right? This great biblical style flood, and he ends up at the top of the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is mid-crumble, and he ends up in the ocean, and he eventually gets captured / saved by these looters, right? And these looters trap him and hold him hostage. He manages to escape, and then he ends up climbing the Empire State Building to get a high vantage point, and then sees in the distance a building that has lights on. And so he goes off to that building, he gets caught again, and he manages to escape again, and he finds that this building has robots in it, right? He doesn't know where these robots come from because technology like that doesn't exist in 1986, but he knows that it has to do with Sambol, right? And so he needs people to help him, but he doesn't really know anyone except the looters. So he decides to go to the looters for help, and he meets their boss, whose name is Sun Ray, and he's this cool black guy dude who is in charge of the looters, and he's really smart. It turns out that Laureline is also there, and so she saves them, and then they do some reconnaissance, and then they come back to tell Sun Ray what happened. They tell him about the robots, and then they go down into the depths through the bottom of the city to go find Sambol. Then they end up in a firefight against these robots, and they get beat. And so Sambol has the upper hand, and he forces the robots he forces Valerian and Laureline and Sun Ray to be taken by the robots to his hideouts, right? And so this is where the story ends. And the next part of the story, The Earth in Flames, starts, right? So they end up in the Rocky Mountains, which are still above sea level because the coasts go first and then everything after that, right? They're brought to Sambol. They see the scientist. His name is Schroeder. And he's behind the technology that Sambol is using. Apparently, this guy was really intelligent and had a lot of abilities, and it was kind of nebulous why he was working with Sambol. It basically turns out that he's being held hostage, right? Laureline is trapped and then shrunk, which is pretty funny. It's kind of cute where Valerian ends up doing this kind of like Peter Pan and Tinkerbell routine with her for a little bit, and it's kind of fun. Then they manage to beat Sambol, but they must escape before the robots attack them because they're directly cyclically linked to Sambol, and so they protect them, right? So they escape, and then they start traveling, and they meet this farmer, and they travel some more. They eventually end up in this city or town in the Rocky Mountains. They get weapons out of this military base that's there, and then they go back to Sambol to get to fight him off again. However, at this point, they get caught in bubbles. And this is where the One Piece stuff kind of feels very similar, right? First of all, there's a time, a void. There is a kind of apocalyptic rising sea level, and our heroes are trapped in bubbles, right? That's all very similar to stuff that's happening in Egghead right now, and it's really cool and interesting, and I really, really like that. I think it's nice, and also it brings into question, like, does Oda read Valerian? Does he have this interesting kind of connection to all of these classic comic books, or is it just a case of like what's it called, like convergent thinking, right? Like how Naruto and Harry Potter are very similar. They came out in very similar times, but they have nothing to do with each other, right? Or is it that, you know, because he's making this fun sci-fi story, he took inspiration from classic sci-fi comics, and Valerian was the one that he picked, right? He also has a lot of stuff that relates to Star Wars, so it's not like he's taking directly from Valerian, but it was really interesting that was so connected and so similar, right? So really good stuff there. I really liked it. I think it's really cool. And of course, we also have that crazy smart scientist that somehow has to do with these weird technologies, right? So very cool stuff. So they get caught in the bubbles. Sambo escapes to space. They chase him up into space thanks to this failed experiment that Schroeder had made. That was a time machine of some sort. But Laureline and Valerian obviously have, like, I was going to say modern, but it's not modern. It's actually like future abilities and technology and stuff. So they managed to make it work. They go into space. They go into the space station that Sambo is in. And they confront him. Sambo escapes. And as he escapes, he has an accident that basically kills him. And so Sunray decides to stay behind in the past, even though he figures out that they're from the future. And I'm not really sure how he gets to stay, but Laureline had to go. And then he decides to basically take over the world, right? And so there's this like little nebulous feeling at the end of the story, which is like, did they save the world and Sunray becoming the leader of this human like survival force supposed to happen with Schroeder to help him, or did they change history but not enough that it affected them, right? It's kind of unknown, but it's pretty fun, right? So yeah, they saved the world, they saved time, and Galaxity will continue to exist. So good stuff. And then finally, the Empire of 1,000 Planets, or the City of 1,000 Planets, whatever you want to call it, 1971. And this is the story that I think is probably what everyone that thinks of Valerian and Laureline kind of thinks about. And it's a good story. It has a lot of these, like a lot of it does feel similar to Star Wars, but not necessarily the original Star Wars that came out around the same time. It feels like bits and pieces from all of Star Wars, even the modern stuff, right? So that's why I really don't think that what they say at the beginning of this book is true, right? Star Wars did not ape off directly from Valerian, right? But I can't deny that there are a lot of similar things if you just look at images, right? If you look at the actual story, it's quite different. But this is pretty cool stuff, right? So basically they explain the universe. They say, you know, the universe is ever expanding. There's planets everywhere that have life. And in this specific area of the world, or of the universe, this planet has managed to extend its influence far and wide and has become this empire of 1,000 planets. And this is Circe the Magnificent, right? And it's very Star Wars. I really like it. I think it's cool. We get introduced to these religious leaders that cover their faces with these cool medieval-looking iron masks. And we learn that Valerian and Laureline are getting to go to this place because they have to figure out if this is going to be a threat to humanity. And so they get there, they go into this kind of like marketplace. It reminds me a lot of the beginning of Aladdin, right? Where, you know, Aladdin is walking through this place that is like this bazaar, right? It has that same kind of feel to it. And then they manage to make it to the city. They get attacked. They find out about the bad stuff that the religious leaders are doing. And then they have this really cool dogfight in the air that's across the planet. It's really, really interesting and really enjoyable. They crash. They have this really beautiful moment together. And then they're attacked and then saved by these hunters that are hunting this giant snake or lizard. And these savage people help them come back to the city so that they can go stop these religious bad guys, right? they sneak into this party. Valerian is caught, and then Laureline saves him. And then they meet with the Traders Guild, right? Who are trying to set up this coup, and this is actually much more similar to like Foundation than it is like to Star Wars. Because in Foundation, there's this group of people that fight against the Empire. They go away, and then they come back later, and they use technology to create religion, and then they use trade to create power for themselves, right? So this is basically what's going on here. And then these groups are fighting against this established empire, right? So good stuff there. I really like this. I think it's interesting. Then the Traders Guild manages to gather a force, and they go off to fight the religious leaders in their home base, which is this asteroid. They manage to win. Valerian gets to meet these religious leaders, and they take off their masks, and it turns out that they're ancient humans from something that was told to us in the first story about these ancient arcs that humanity sent out into the world when before Galaxity was a thing. And these guys are survivors from that, right? They took on this elixir or this thing that allowed them to live long, but it actually was giving them like a half-life, right? Like they weren't really alive anymore, but they didn't really want to die either, so they just kept going, right? And they swore to destroy Earth because Earth left them. But the thing is that Earth didn't even know they were alive, right? So, yeah, and then basically they decide to off themselves because they basically realize that they lost, that there's nothing for them, and so they decide to off themselves, right? And so the story ends with them doing that, this kind of like sacrifice that allows the story to end up neatly with a nice bow at the end, right? And then Valerian and Laureline go off home to, tell them Circe is not a problem. We're friends with the guys that are in charge, right? Which are the Traders Guild now. So overall, this is probably my favorite story, but it does lack a little bit of like oomph to it, right? Like if this is a modern story, I feel like there'd be a lot more work done and it'd be a lot more powerful nowadays. But at the same time, I think from the time period, this is probably the coolest story that there ever was, right? So I really get why this is such a well-known story. I really like it. I think it's cool, but it does lack a little bit from the perspective of a modern reader, right? So that's it for the content of the book. Now, for other kind of like general things here, in terms of characters, the characters that matter are Valerian and Laureline. Everyone else doesn't really matter. I mean, Valerian's boss is kind of relevant because he shows up pretty often, but I don't know his name. I don't think they ever mentioned it, and if they did, it was so unimportant that I forgot about it. And every story has a different bad guy, right? So it's not important to remember them necessarily. It's important that you know who Valerian is, who is a native to Galaxity. He's a time cop of some sort. And then Laureline, who is this woman native to medieval France, who becomes a time cop, becomes Valerian's lover in some sense at the end of the Empire of 1,000 Planets. And she became a time cop when she figured out that Valerian was in the future, right? So, that's basically it for characters. That's all you really need to know. And in terms of world building, you just need to know that Galaxity is the future utopian city that happens after the apocalypse forms, or happens, that forms after the apocalypse happens. There you go. That's the right order of words there. And it has the ability of time travel and severe space travel. Like they can make it to anywhere in the universe without affecting time dilation, right? So good stuff in that sense, but really there's not really much that you need to know. This is all pretty basic stuff. The really interesting stuff is how do Valerian and Laureline get out of the situations that they find themselves in, right? So yeah, in terms of artwork and fan service, the artwork is really old school. It has good stuff to it. I really like it. I think it's a really nice cartoony vibe that is very, French and European comic book like styled. But I do have issues with the coloring. Now, I don't know if this is because the coloring is old, and so they had very limited abilities to color, or if it's because they chose to do this deliberately, and I just don't like it. And the worst part that I find is that they don't really color the whites of the characters' eyes properly, or at least they do sometimes, and then not others, right? So, like here, you can see Valerian's white eyeballs, right? But then, let's see. here, you can't, even though they're clearly visible. So they did a different painting technique, and this is really inconsistent across the story, right? And is it important? No. Is it distracting? Yes. And that's really the part that I don't like, that it's like I'm trying to stay interested in the story that's kind of old and not really that impactful to a modern audience, and then I keep getting distracted by these weird little choices that they made with the colors, right? And in terms of like fan service stuff, there's a scene or two that are pretty sexy in the Empire of 1,000 Planets, but that's not really the case throughout the whole book, right? So the first story doesn't really have anything, of that sort. The second story doesn't either in either one of the issues that cover it. And the third story has some of that stuff because there's this kind of like Middle Eastern kind of vibe to it, right? So these characters are wearing these like slave outfits and stuff like that, right? So it's not like super out there, but there is some element of like sexuality to the characters throughout that part of the story, but it's not really anything super important or big, right? It's not meaningful. But yeah, so overall, I mean, the artwork in fan service is good. When it happens, the fan service is nice. The coloring is not my favorite. I kind of understand why it is that way. However, this is a modern printing. I would have liked them to fix those issues. But at the same time, I guess someone, probably most people, would complain about the fact that it's not like how it was in the original. And I understand that, but these are quality of life changes. They're not really meaningful changes to the storytelling or anything like that, right? And the translation is not bad. I mean, I really didn't have any issues where I couldn't understand anything that was being said. The editing is good on it and stuff like that, but there's a certain level of clunkiness to the story and to the dialogue, but I think that's just how it was written initially, right? So there really is no point in complaining about that either. So ratings-wise, 3.5 out of 5, like I said. I like it, but it's old, and that really is noticeable. And it's not like my love for the genre doesn't really like save this story from being less enjoyable than modern ones, right? Just because of how old it is. But at the same time, it's not so bad that I would not read more. I actually do want to buy the rest of this collection. I want to read all of Valerian and Laureline and figure out why this story is so meaningful and valuable to so many European comic book artists, right? And so many European comic book writers, and honestly to comic books as a medium throughout the world, right? Why is this story so important? What exactly about it is valuable, right? I want to learn that, so I want to read the rest of it. But that's not necessarily because I enjoyed this story that much. It's because I find value in what this represents and what this means for the genre, right? So I just have to keep iterating that, but I'm sure it's annoying at this point. So that's all of my thoughts on Valerian, book 1 in the complete collection by Kristin and Mezieres. What did you guys think about this video? What do you guys think about the series? Have you read it before? Let me know down in the comments. And thank you guys very much for watching. See you guys later.